Welcome back. We've been talking about how plants make plant parts, and we talked last time about the primary plant body and how the apical meristems make the shoots and the roots and all the parts inside and outside. Now we're going to ask, how is wood made? Only some plants make wood, and those are the woody plants. Woody plants always live for more than a year, so they're perennials. Woody plants include trees, they include shrubs, they include some vines. All conifers are woody, and some eudicots are woody. So today we're going to look at how wood is produced and also how bark is produced. Plants that make wood also make bark, and those are made by two particular meristems. Then we're going to ask, how do fluids move in plants? As you know, there is the xylem and there is the phloem, and they conduct particular kinds of fluids throughout the plant body, and they are great adaptations for living in a dry environment, that is, the terrestrial environment. So let's get going. So plants have these meristems, these constantly dividing, perpetually dividing tissues in specified locations. They're at the tips of shoots and the tips of roots. These are the primary meristems. So the shoot apical meristem and the root apical meristem. They occur in all the vascular plants. Some plants, however, also make wood. And these plants have two other meristems, and these meristems are called lateral meristems. The lateral meristems include two types. First, the vascular cambium, and second, the cork cambium. And these produce what is called secondary growth. That is, they're not produced directly by the primary meristems. These occur, as I mentioned, in conifers and in some eudicots. These make wood and bark. So here's a typical example of a woody plant. This is an oak, and you can see wood and bark here. The bulk of this organism is wood, and it's shown by this bracket here. And then outside on this diagram, you can see some bark. So how does this arise? How do some plants make wood? Well, every plant begins its life with primary meristems. That's without exception. So even woody plants start out their life with primary meristems. And you can see on the left a typical plant with the primary meristems, the shoot apical meristem and the root apical meristem. Now look at the upper right. We're going to take a cross-section of some young tissues in the shoot in this case. And you can see that this is a eudicot because the vascular bundles are in a nice ring. And here we have the epidermis, we have the cortex, and we have the vascular bundles. There's something in the middle you can call the pith. That's just other ground tissue in the center. So this material is going to produce new meristems. It's going to produce the cork cambium and the vascular cambium. How does that happen? Well, first of all, have a look at this. Look at the upper right. I've drawn a circle here through the vascular bundles and in the cortex between the vascular bundles. This is the new vascular cambium. This is produced by old strands of procambium inside the vascular bundles between the xylem and the phloem, the primary xylem and primary phloem. And it's also produced by the cortical cells in between the vascular bundles. So now we have this nice ring, and this ring is a new meristem. That is to say, it retains forever during the life of the plant the ability to divide. It's about 1 cell thick, and there it is. So, move down to the bottom right, and we have drawn this organism a little later in development. This vascular cambium is going to produce tissues. In particular, and this is really the essential point, the vascular cambium makes phloem to the outside. That's called secondary phloem. And the vascular cambium makes xylem to the inside. That's called secondary xylem. And you should think of secondary xylem as being really what wood is. So the vascular cambium makes secondary xylem to the inside. So have a look at this diagram. You can see the developing tissues. So first of all, find the vascular cambium. It's that dark or red, if you see red, it's the red circle. And inside the red circle is some blue. That blue is secondary xylem. It is xylem that has been made by the vascular cambium. To the outside of the vascular cambium, you see a brownish ring, and that brownish ring is secondary phloem, produced once again, by the vascular cambium. What else is going on? Well, you can see that the vascular cambium and the two tissues it's produced, the secondary xylem and secondary phloem, have now split apart the original vascular bundles. They've split them. So you can see on the inside, you can see the little bit of primary xylem, and to the outside, you can see the portion of a vascular bundle that is the primary phloem. It's been split apart. This is just going to wither away and become non-functional as the plant develops. You can see some remnants of the pith in the center that will just wither away and become essentially non-functional. And on the outside, of course, you can see the edge of the plant. Okay, so that's the vascular cambium, one of our two meristems in woody plants. There is a second meristem in woody plants to the outside, and that's called the cork cambium. The cork cambium is shown here. You can see it labeled, and it's got this tissue to the outside of it called the periderm, and the cork cambium is what makes the new protective layer of a woody plant. Woody plants don't have an epidermis. Woody plants have instead material to the outside that's called bark. So this cork cambium produces periderm, which is part of the bark. So that's it. That's the two meristems that are involved in the production of woody plants. Here's another picture. This is another diagram from your textbook, and this is simply another way to look at what I just showed you. So it's more of a three-dimensional viewpoint. You can see here the periderm, you can see the pith in the center, and you can see the primary xylem and the primary phloem have been split by the vascular cambium and the two tissues that it makes. Here's another way to look at it. If you take a cross-section of a woody plant and look down at the top of the cross-section, you can see there are these C-labeled cells. That stands for cambium, so that's vascular cambium in this case. A cambial cell, a meristematic cell of any type, makes two cells when it divides. So it produces a daughter cell and a daughter cell. One of those daughter cells, because this is a meristem, one of those daughter cells remains a cambial cell, a meristematic cell. The other one you can call D for daughter, and that one goes on to differentiate into something. So how does that cell know what to differentiate into? Well, the answer is location. The answer is location. So if the daughter cell is inside, it will become secondary xylem, and if it's to the outside, it will become secondary phloem. So if you look at this diagram here, you can see P for secondary phloem and X for secondary xylem. That shows you where the inside and the outside of the plant are, because you know phloem is formed to the outside. This meristem, vascular cambium, makes secondary phloem and secondary xylem. The cambium also makes some other tissues called rays, and these are parenchymal strands that allow the transfer of materials into and out of the plant in a lateral direction. That's why they're called rays. Think of radially. And we'll talk about those in just a little bit. So here's your vascular cambium. This is what I just showed you. If you want to have a different look, there it is. You can have a look at this, and this is simply another diagram from your textbook and another way to understand what's going on. One thing you'll notice here is that growth occurs because cells are produced by the vascular cambium. So it is continually pushing itself outward. This single ring of cells, one cell layer deep more or less, is continually making material to the inside. That's wood, secondary xylem. So therefore, it's pushing itself outward. It's pushing out, and that's why a tree gets bigger in diameter over time. It's pushing itself out as it adds new rings of secondary xylem or new material of secondary xylem to the inside. So vascular cambium also makes rays. What is that? Well, if you were able to go up to a tree and take a guillotine and shave that tree right down inside, just at the level where the vascular cambium occurs, that single cell layer thick like a stovepipe, If you were able to do that, this is what you would see. You would see this. This shows the two sorts of cells in a vascular cambium. There are, first of all, these fusiform initials. Fusiform initials are called fusiform because they're tapered, and that's what fusiform means. They make the tracheids, they make the vessel elements. That's the primary part of xylem. They also make the sieve tube elements, the primary part of phloem. So these are produced to the inside if they are xylem or to the outside if they are phloem. These produce those cells to the inside and to the outside. You'll see also these collections of cells called ray initials. And the ray initials are in these groups of many cells, and they produce material that runs radially from the inside to the outside of the plant. And this allows the transfer of materials to the inside and to the outside, that is, laterally. And this travels through both the xylem and the phloem. And this is parenchymal tissue, actually. So here's a nice illustration of all of these ideas. So remember that wood is secondary xylem for the most part, and wood is made up of tracheids or vessel elements, or both, depending on the species. And these cell walls, the secondary cell walls, are filled with the polymer called lignin. And you can see in this particular example, there are these rays. This is very evident in oak. If you look at oak, you will always see rays. It's very, very obvious. It's a very nice feature of oak and one reason that it's so prized. So these rays are traveling radially, and they allow the transfer of stuff in and out in a radial direction. You can also see here there are a couple of colors. So the center of this trunk is darker than the outer part. The center is called the heartwood. The outer part is called the sapwood. The heartwood is filled with lots of materials. You can think of it as filled with waste products. And the sapwood is where most of the water is actually conducted up the tree. Most of the xylem sap is conducted up the tree. So heartwood and sapwood, these are often prized by woodworkers because of the different colors, and heartwood is perhaps a protective part of the tree to help keep it from rotting, to help keep it from being attacked by bacteria and fungi. You can also see here growth rings. Why are there growth rings? Growth rings occur in organisms that live in environments with different seasons. And growth rings exist because of a difference in the diameter of the cells produced in the secondary xylem at different times of the year. So early in the spring, there are wide cells produced. As the season moves along, during the summer, the cells become smaller in diameter. In the fall, much smaller. In the winter, they stop being produced, or they become very, very narrow in diameter. Next year, there are cells that are produced in the early spring that are big in diameter once again, and the process begins. And that's why you have rings in many tree species. So here's a slide I showed you last time. Remember that lignin is this fabulous, fabulous polymer, the second most common polymer on Earth, and it is what makes up a lot of wood. Somewhere between 20 and 33% of wood by dry weight is lignin itself, and this material is removed to make paper. It's used for other purposes by humans, and one of the weirdest purposes is the production of artificial vanilla flavoring. So I've shown you this slide before. So have a look at this. This has pretty much everything in it with regard to secondary growth. First of all, you'll notice there are rings. So that can orient you right away. So if you see these three rings that look pretty similar, I've labeled them 1, 2, and 3. Those are rings of secondary xylem. These rings of secondary xylem were produced in 3 separate years. Year 1 of life, year 2 of life, and year 3 of life. Find the vascular cambium. Once you find that, you're on your way. So if you find the rings, you can say the vascular cambium is the layer of cells to the outside of those tree rings. And there it is, I've labeled it. You know that outside the vascular cambium is the secondary phloem. So here it is. Okay, so now you've found the vascular cambium, the xylem, and the phloem. But this plant requires protection. There's no longer an epidermis, no longer that single waxy layer of cells. Instead, there's something else. and that something else is produced by the cork cambium, and it produces cork, and there's cork to the outside of the cork cambium. So the cork cambium is another type of meristem that helps make protective tissues. What is this stuff? By the way, have a look at these rings. You can also see that when each ring starts growth, that's toward the center, the diameter of the cells, the tracheids or vessel elements, is great. As the season progresses, the diameter of the cells decreases. Okay, so this is about protection in woody plants. This is the cork cambium, which also has this other strange name called the phloem. This is the new lateral meristem, and it arises from the cortex cells outside the vascular cambium, and it also can arise from cells in the secondary phloem. So it produces what's called the periderm. And the periderm is itself made up of 3 layers. There's something called the pheloderm in some woody species, and this is just a thin layer of living parenchymal cells. It produces more of itself, the cork cambium itself, and then to the outside, it produces cork. Cork is suberized cells. They are dead. Suberized means that they are filled with suberin, which is a wax. So they're cells filled with wax. This is what protects the plant from attack. It protects the plant, most importantly, from water loss. So here's the anatomy of a tree trunk, and we can put all the names together now. First, find the vascular cambium. There it is. It's in green in this diagram from your book, and you can see inside is the secondary xylem, the wood. And there is the sapwood, and inside that is the heartwood. As you go out from the vascular cambium, you can see the secondary phloem. So there's living phloem, and outside of that is the cork cambium. Now the cork cambium is producing the cork to the outside. What are these other words, these words like bark and periderm? Well, periderm is simply the cork cambium and the cork, and bark is everything outside the vascular cambium. Bark is everything outside the vascular cambium. So you might have been traveling here in Nova Scotia and seen a tree that was ringed by a porcupine. That is, the porcupine came along and ate the bark around the tree. And if you do that, if a porcupine does that, it goes all the way into the phloem, and therefore the plant is killed, at least killed above that spot. And that's because the porcupine has removed the living phloem, and therefore the plant can no longer move materials from the photosynthesizing leaves above to anything below. So these are the various tissues: the bark, the periderm, the cork cambium, the cork. These are strange words, but there they are, and it's actually quite simple and quite straightforward. So the bark is everything outside the vascular cambium. So that means the secondary phloem on out. Here's cork. You know cork as the source of cork boards, bulletin boards. You also know cork as the source of wine bottle stoppers. And cork is filled with a wax. So if you've ever taken stoppers for wine bottles and boiled them, you will find that whatever you're boiling in, the kettle you boil these in, will be covered with wax, and that's because of the wax that's in these cells. This is called suberin, and cork is produced in great quantities by an oak that's common in Portugal and nearby areas, and this oak is called Quercus suber, referring to the suberin that's so prevalent. And you can see here how this bark on the right is just very thick with cork material. So here is a 3-year-old stem. You can see the 3 years of growth of the secondary xylem of the wood. You can see the bark outside the vascular cambium. You can orient yourself and figure out that the vascular cambium is that single layer of cells to the outside of the secondary xylem, and outside of the secondary phloem is the cork cambium and the cork. So this is another picture of what we just talked about. And here is putting everything together. This is primary growth and secondary growth. So have a look at this diagram from your text and see if you can put everything together. This is exactly what we just talked about. There are all these steps presented. Primary growth is what starts the plant body, and then any woody plant makes secondary growth using these 2 meristems, the vascular cambium and the cork cambium. So if you were to draw a path diagram of the beginning of a plant developing into all of its different tissues, this is what you would come up with. You start out with an apical meristem from the original embryo, the original sporophyte, and this makes the protoderm, the procambium, and the ground meristem. The apical meristem then makes, of course, the epidermis, the vascular bundles with their primary xylem and primary phloem. It makes the ground tissue, the pith and the cortex. And then, in those species that are woody, it makes the vascular cambium and the cork cambium. Where do these arise from? Well, the vascular cambium, as you know, arises from the procambium and also a little bit from cortex tissue. And the cork cambium arises from the cortex and also somewhat from the secondary phloem. So the cork cambium and the cork are called periderm, and the cork cambium makes cork to the outside of it. And then the vascular cambium makes secondary xylem, secondary phloem, and rays. So that's it. That's how a woody plant is produced. Next time, we're going to talk about how fluids move in plants. See you then.